Good afternoon, members and guests. We have recessed the regular session and we are convening the joint convention. The California Senate and our invited guests are in the Assembly chamber. With us today are constitutional officers, our Lieutenant Governor, John Garamendi, State Treasurer, Bill Lockyer, State Controller, John Chung, Legislative Analyst, Mac Taylor, Department of Finance, Michael Janess, Senate President Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg. Members and guests, all of us here today are aware that the fiscal crisis facing California is part and parcel of a financial meltdown that is having devastating consequences across the nation. We have been struggling in California to balance the budget and to address the looming $28 billion deficit facing the state. The urgency and severity of this crisis is what has led the legislative leaders to convene this historic joint convention of the legislature. A meeting of this type, where both houses of the legislature come together to address a crisis, is unprecedented in California history. The urgency and severity of this crisis requires that all of us, all 120 legislators, come together with the LAO, the State Treasurer, Controller, and the Department of Finance to ensure in full public view that we are all hearing the same information at the same time. The urgency and severity of this crisis requires all of us to act, and to act immediately. As we work through the process, as our budget committees review options, as we negotiate solutions, and as we vote on proposals, Senator Steinberg and I wanted to ensure that we are all operating from an objective set of facts. This session will provide that objective review of the state's fiscal picture and will, I hope, lay the groundwork for bipartisan solutions. While acting on the tough solutions will be difficult, we will learn today from our panel of experts that inaction will have catastrophic results for California. We need to act to shore up our cash, preserve our credit rating, and solve a major share of our $28 billion problem. Closing our massive budget gap will take tough decisions and true leadership from each and every one of us. I want to thank the presenters today for helping to provide a framework for the difficult choices we will have to make. And it is now my pleasure to welcome to these chambers for the first time as President Pro Tem, my partner, Senator Darrell Steinberg.
Thank you very, very much, Madam Speaker, for suggesting this unprecedented forum and for inviting my colleagues and I to your chambers. Thank you as well to our State Treasurer, Controller, our Lieutenant Governor, the Department of Finance, Mike Janess, and Mac Taylor, our Legislative Analyst. We have all spent a great deal of time, members, not just over the past month or the past months, but over many years, debating the solutions to California's chronic budget deficit. But the fact of the matter is, we cannot effectively even argue about the right solutions unless and until we agree on the urgency and the gravity of the problem itself. While partisanship is aplenty here under the dome, this is not, I assert, a partisan or ideological problem. The nation's largest economic crisis since the Great Depression, an international crisis, is mostly responsible for our gathering here today. We all know that in times of national crisis, that our country has a history of different parties and ideologies coming together to do what's right for our nation. Let it be said about us that when all is said and done, we rose to the moment on behalf of the people of California. Our message is simple today. Before we begin arguing the solutions, let's understand the problem. Let's defy the expectations. Let's live up to the challenge. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the panel.
Members, our guest speakers may refer to documents on your desks in the course of their presentations. And just in terms of how we will proceed, we will ask that each of the guests speak when the entire panel is finished. Then we will open up for questions, and we will go back and forth between the Assembly and the Senate. Our first speaker is the legislative analyst, Mac Taylor.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. With me today is my colleague Dan Carson, one of my deputies. And you have in front of you this blue document entitled The State's Budget Situation. And I would like to very briefly go through that and try to outline the problem that the state faces. On page 1, we start with the budget that was passed not more than 3 months ago in September, where we had a budget of about $103 billion in general fund spending, relatively flat over the prior year, and we were only able to do that with a variety of one-time revenue solutions. And as a result, we knew going into the 9-10 fiscal year that we already faced a serious problem. In fact, it was estimated by the Department of Finance that we would have an operating shortfall of about $6 billion going into 9-10. So we already start from a problem perspective. If you turn the page then, we updated our economic revenue and expenditure projections in November, shortly after the Department of Finance updated their revenue numbers. And we determined that the state had a $28 billion problem. And what we mean by that is if the legislature and the governor did nothing, the state would face a $28 billion hole at the end of the 9-10 year on June 30th, 2010. And that would consisted of about a $9 billion current year problem and a $19 billion operating deficit in 9-10. The largest reason for that problem was, of course, related to revenues. The prior numbers that I spoke to on the first page were based on numbers that were presented in May, the May revision. And since that time, everyone is aware of the rather precipitous decline in the economy and the resulting impact on revenues. And we estimated that revenues are down from what was assumed in the budget by $25 billion over the 2-year period. This is very similar to the administration's estimate. If you turn the page, we then looked at, well, what happens over the out years? Does the problem get better? Does the problem get worse? And as you see by the chart, that the $19 billion operating deficit in 2009-10 actually grows to roughly $22 billion in our out years. And again, that's assuming no action on the part of the legislature. And we're not trying to say this is our prediction of what will happen, but it just gives you an idea of the trends involved in our current revenue and expenditure forecast. Now, if you turn the page, why is this such an unusual situation? We have had individual years where we had larger numbers, but I really think this is a rather dire situation for you. And that's because, first, we are coming off a very difficult year, a year in which you didn't have a budget until September, which is very difficult to balance. You saw from the prior page that we have large ongoing deficits. They don't get better on the natural over time. We are projecting a relatively slow recovery in the economy. This is the consensus view, I think, of almost all economists, that 2009 will have very mild growth, and it's not until 2010 that we expect the economy to start picking up again. And finally, we have a lot of solutions that have been taken that have either been used or are off the table. We've already balanced our budget in recent years, primarily with the use of debt. The $15 billion in deficit reduction financing bonds that were approved by the voters in Proposition 57 have been used. We've used lots of special fund loans. We've taken lots of one-time actions. You just don't have as many options as you did in prior years. Now, if you turn the page, just an example of how big the problem is. If we just look at the $19 billion operating deficit that you face for 9-10, assuming you can take care of the 8-9 problem with other means, what would it take to solve a $19 billion problem? And if you solve the problem only through tax or revenue increases, you would have to do all three of these things. You would have to increase the sales tax by 2 cents, which would give us the highest sales tax rate in the country. You would have to levy a 15% personal income tax surcharge. We already have the highest marginal income tax rates in the country. And you would have to increase the corporate tax rate by 2 percentage points, and that would give us the highest corporate tax rate in the nation. If you turn the page, alternatively, what would you face if you tried to address this $19 billion operating deficit solely on the expenditure side? Well, not only would you have to reduce programs, but if you just look at a handful, you would have to completely eliminate funding for our universities, UC and CSU. You would have to eliminate all funding for welfare programs, CalWORKs, and payments to the elderly and the disabled. And you would have to eliminate all funding for developmental services, mental health, and in-home supportive services in order to close that gap. If you turn the page, we show in a very brief form the governor's special session proposals. These were as of November, and it's just to give you an idea of the relative mix between the 2 years and between the revenue increases that the governor is proposing and the expenditure savings that he is proposing. And I'll let Mr. Jeunesse speak more to those. If you turn the page, we then looked at, well, what happens if you adopt every one of the governor's proposals? What we found is that you would largely eliminate your problems in 8-9, 9-10, and 10-11. Now, the fact that the proposals were not adopted in November, you do lose some of the savings, there is some erosion, but you do come close over the next 3 years of addressing your problem. However, in the out years, beginning in 11, 12, 12, 13, and thereafter, large operating deficits return. And this is largely because there are some significant one-time solutions in the governor's budget, primarily a $10 billion worth of lottery securitization revenues that would be used in 9-10 and 10-11, and the sales tax increase, the governor's primary revenue source or increase, ends after 3 years at the end of 2011. So then if you turn the page, let me just briefly talk about our take on the governor's special session. We think as a framework, as a general approach, there were many positive aspects to what the governor proposed to you. And that's because we felt there were realistic numbers. We had very little differences, significant differences on the revenue estimates or on his solutions, what the governor was suggesting you would get out of taking those actions. There was no budgetary borrowing. There were no one-time solutions. All of the things that the administration proposed had multiple year effects, which we think you need to do at the very least. And it was a balanced approach. It had both expenditure reductions, real reductions in base spending, and it had some revenue increases. And now if you turn the page to page 10, what we came out with in mid-November in response to the governor's proposal was our assessment, our quick assessment. And what we tried to do is offer you other options, in some cases alternatives to what the governor had proposed, and in other cases additional options on both the spending and the revenue side to give you the widest possible array to select from. In particular, though, we did offer you an alternative approach on Proposition 98. The governor basically said we're going to take money out of schools' most flexible form of spending their revenue limits and then allow them to use reserves and access their categorical programs to achieve those savings. We felt like that was kind of the reverse of what you should do, that you need to preserve their revenue limit funding, and to the extent that there are state-designated categorical programs that are no longer of a high priority, that we should go in and change them, eliminate them, modify them, suspend them, and in fact make the decisions on these state programs. We also felt like you needed to give school districts more time to respond. It's very difficult for them to lay off teachers, to make changes in the middle of the year. So we had less cuts in 8-9, more in 9-10, so that the school districts had a chance to respond to your proposals. And finally, let me just close by the importance of acting soon, very soon. And I think there's several reasons, but I want to focus on the first one that's on the page. And that is it makes your task much, much easier. Just out of your own self-interest, the faster that you act, the easier it will be to solve your budget problem. There is no constitutional requirement for you to finish the 8-9 year in the black. There is a constitutional requirement that you enact a balanced 9-10 budget. And to the extent that you delay, you have more solution. You have to take care of that 8-9 problem at the same time that you pass your 9-10 budget. So I would urge you to take action as soon as possible. It allows the spending reductions to go into effect sooner. It allows any revenue increases to go into effect sooner. Now, I mentioned 3 other reasons why, but I want to defer those to the other speakers. Our cash problems, which I know that Mike and the controller will speak to. I mentioned the signaling other parties. If you act now, it is much easier on beneficiaries, university students, school districts, local governments, if they know what's coming in 9-10. And finally, if you pass a budget now, or if you take significant solutions now, it will allow you to issue bonds for infrastructure projects, probably one of the most important ways you have to do economic stimulus. And again, I know the Treasurer is going to speak to that. So I'll stop with that, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. We'll now hear from the Director of the Department of Finance, Mr. Michael Janess.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I'd like to introduce the person that's with me, Ana Mata Santos, who many of you know if you sit on budget